Welcome back, folks. In this entry, we'll be taking a look at Bane, specifically from the iteration played by Tom Hardy in The Dark Knight Rises. A brutally menacing and fearsome antagonist, Bane's life was one that was marked by personal injustice and tragedy, leading to his eventual transformation into a tool only to be used by the League of Shadows for vengeful destruction. A man so scarred by the abyss of hopelessness that he would seek to impose the same sentiment on his victims. This tragedy began with his upbringing, which is the first and perhaps the most important aspect we need to consider about him. From what is revealed to us, it's strongly hinted that Bane was born in the same prison that Talia was also born in. Now, I'm aware that Talia was the actual person referred to in the legend in the one about the child born in the pit who managed to escape. But from Bane's own admission about being born in the darkness and not seeing the light until he was a man, combined with the rumors that Alfred brought up surrounding him, the simple conclusion we can assume is that both Bane and Talia were born in the same prison. If that is true, then its implications are provoking. If Bane was born in prison, then that would mean that his mother was inside at the time of his birth as well. Of course, the details of her incarceration are completely out of our grasp, but given that, this is simply a male-populated prison. Having a woman inside is a huge anomaly, and possibly the result of a unique set of circumstances, as was with Talia. And if Bane's mother was also in prison, then the sad but likely outcome would have been that she suffered the same horrific fate as Talia's mother, with young Bane being powerless to help her as the hordes of men did as they pleased. Nothing else would explain Bane's natural affinity towards Talia, the fact that he was a victim of the same evil that took the life of his own mother. So for Bane, Talia isn't just one singular symbol of innocence left in his life. She is also the one person who can empathize with him and can, in turn, relate to him. After the death of Talia's mother, it would seem that Bane and Talia were friends for an unknown number of years in the pit, with Bane playing the role of her protector and keeping the truth of Talia's gender a secret, as hinted at by her short hair. Things reached a turning point when, in my best guess, one of the men discovered that Talia was a girl, and Bane killed the man seen on the left in defense of her, but not before her identity was revealed to the entire prison. With the hordes of men swarming in to deal Talia the same fate as her mother, there was only one choice left for her: to escape the pit by making the impossible leap. Bane, however, is left behind to suffer in agony after the wrath of the prisoners was exacted on him. In light of all this, we can get a good picture of Bane's worldview since his tragic childhood. The fact that he was born in prison is by itself an injustice against him. Even if his parents did something to deserve punishment, a newborn baby should not have to bear the horror of growing up in a cage, especially a barbaric one in the pit, without any formal authority to govern them. And I'm sure there was no lack of unsavory personalities in the pit that Bane had to be wary of, which would further taint his perception of the world. Then we have Bane's early exposure to evil, from the murder of his own mother to witnessing the same fate being done to Talia's mother, and then later attempted on Talia herself. Not to mention the injuries he sustained on his face as a result of the unjustified vengeance of the prisoners. So since young, Bane has only known a few principles: that the world is evil, that it's human nature for others to take what they want by force, and if it so happens that their interests have a direct opposition to yours, then you'd better hope that you have the strength to fight back. In light of this, it's of little surprise that a person bearing such a mindset would be an easy candidate to become radicalized by the extreme teachings of the League of Shadows, especially when its leader is the father of the only symbol of innocence in your life. For Bane, the prison was the only world he knew all his life, and I'd imagine there was quite a fish-out-of-water experience for him upon his departure from the pit, combined with an empty void from a loss of purpose. This void was then filled with a rekindled purpose from his new mentor, to cleanse the world of the corruption that plagues it through destruction. This is the crux of his character, that Bane has no life purpose of his own, save for a vicarious one adopted from the League of Shadows. And how could he, given that his former way of life since birth would make integrating into a regular society a challenge to say the least? I'd imagine that Bane saw Roz as a father figure, being grateful to him for rescuing him and for giving meaning to his life, but ultimately incurred his disapproval due to his love for Talia, with Roz wanting to separate himself from any remembrance of the death of his wife. It's likely that this perception of Roz as a surrogate father kept Bane loyal to him and his cause, choosing to later identify himself as the embodiment of the League of Shadows and dedicating himself to fulfill Ra's al Ghul's destiny, to destroy Gotham and exact revenge on Bruce for his betrayal of them. However, it's a misguided sense of destiny, for the fact that Gotham is already clean and relatively free of crime, in contrast to the corrupted state that Ra's al Ghul found the city in as of the events of Batman Begins. There was no need to cleanse the city, so to speak, and the fact that Gotham is now clean disproves the notion of Ra's that the city was beyond saving in the first film. While Bane has left the prison, a part of it will always stay with him in the form of the chronic pain from the injuries he sustained. Bane is a man who is frequently subject to pain, and while the mask helps to alleviate it, it has come off from time to time. Simple activities like eating and drinking, while often pleasurable to regular people, would be excruciating to him. Given his current muscular physique, capped off with a generously round belly, it's likely that Bane would need to consume somewhere in the vicinity of 4,000 calories a day, with that number being a conservative estimate. In light of his condition, it's highly likely that these calories would be consumed in liquid form for the sake of expediency. Bottom line, with such a frequent exposure to pain, Bane is perpetually kept on edge, and each removal of the mask inadvertently serves to fuel the furnace of his rage. Given that his face is mostly concealed, there is only one external cue left for his emotions, that being his eyes, which reflect the full spectrum of his inner feelings, predominantly displaying anger, but sometimes venturing into intimidation, disgust, sorrow, and even tender affection. And while touching on the subject of Bane's physique, it would seem that he has adopted a strongman style of training, focusing on raw power and being able to generate as much force as possible. Bane's strength is remarkable and is surely one of the key components that makes him a formidable opponent. Perhaps the pinnacle of this is seen when he holds Batman up by the neck with one arm. I'd reckon that Bruce conservatively weighs about 200 pounds, while the suit is at least 50, which means that Bane is able to suspend all that weight single-handedly with mainly the force from his bicep and forearm. What's even more impressive is that Bane is relatively advanced in years, given that Bane is at least 10 years older than Talia, and Talia now appears to be in her late 30s or early 40s. Bane should be somewhere in the age range of 40 to 50. As one would expect, this style of strongman training has its payoff in his combat style, with Bane exploiting the advantage of his brute strength. While Bane has been trained by the League of Shadows, it would seem that his approach to combat is a departure from its orthodox ways. He doesn't rely heavily on stealth or distractions, and instead chooses to stand squarely in front of his opponent's face as an immovable object in a show of intimidation. Such is the level of Bane's confidence that he allows Batman to take free shots at him in their first fight, and in an earlier scene, he stands openly vulnerable with his belly hanging out in front of an armed henchman whom he had just threatened to kill. Bane often holds no weapon, save for a few occasions, instead choosing to default to his hands for violent work, whether for crushing windpipes or snapping necks. Theatricality and deception are powerful agents to the uninitiated, with the agents of the League often assuming alter egos, such is the case with both Ra's and Talia. But Bane has no other identity for the obvious reason of the constant need for his mask. And while the members of the League of Shadows were typically dressed as ninjas previously, Bane has revamped that approach, with his men being mercenaries and resembling more of the makeshift soldier in their attire and weapons. The point of all this is that Bane's approach to combat is a reflection of his inner personality and mindset, that he generally approaches things head-on in a direct and straightforward manner, often choosing to plow through with brute force instead of subterfuge. Perhaps this is a byproduct of his time in prison, that when the fight or flight response is triggered, you have to simply act in the heat of the moment. Of course, there are some moments of deception with Bane as well, but these are comparatively few, such as when he chooses to trick the world into believing that Dr. Pavel was dead, and when he manipulates Daggett to exploit his infrastructure for the purposes of the League. As for theatricality, Bane credits his mask for the mystique and the urban legends that embellish his reputation, citing the fact that no one cared who he was before he put the mask on. Bane's departure from the traditional methods of the League isn't just limited to his methods and his management of it, but it is ultimately seen in the achievement of its goal to destroy Gotham. Of course, this might be largely in part due to Talia as well, as it's likely that she bears the same sentiments as Bane, given their similar background. I'd reckon that Ra's al Ghul would not have acted as Bane did or approved of his actions, turning Gotham into a self-contained prison and slowly watching its citizens suffer. From what we've seen, Ra's would have simply put Gotham out of its misery and immediately finished the job. So while Bane declares himself to be fulfilling Ra's al Ghul's destiny, he is doing it his own way. And the reason for this is none other than his compulsion to inflict pain on others. Rather than destroying Gotham outright, Bane decides to extend their suffering, but not before giving the citizens false hope that a Gothamite holds the trigger and that they can survive the ordeal. All this stems from his own experience in the pit, a place he describes as the worst hell on earth for offering false hope to the inmates in the form of the impossible leap. Bane's choice to prolong Gotham's suffering boils down to his sadistic desire to recreate a mirror equivalent of the prison's conditions for Gotham, or in short, to turn Gotham into a place of utter despair. In his own words, there can be no true despair without hope, a principle that was ingrained into his mind from his duration in the pit. This statement is somewhat problematic, given that it's contradictory at face value. Despair and hope are opposites, or despair is the absence of hope, and it's more accurate to say that there can be no true despair with hope. After all, what gave Gordon and the other heroes of Gotham the strength to fight back for their city? None other than their hope of being able to prevail. What gave Bruce the fortitude to climb out of the pit and save his city? Again, the notion of hope. But there is another saying that hope deferred makes the heart sick. So perhaps what Bane was trying to establish was that a person in a desperate situation will be in more severe despair if they had a hope that was crushed, compared to if they never had hope to begin with. Looking back at the state of the prison, we see how this plays out to be true. Other than Bruce and one other inmate, we don't see anyone else attempting to make the leap to freedom. The men have all given up and accepted their fate in prison. In Gotham, we see this similar sense of resignation in Detective Foley, who has simply resigned himself to living out the rest of his days in the confines of his home. Again, this concept of false hope ties in with Bane's sadism, in his desire to spread the same despair that plagued him in his youth. As mentioned earlier, perhaps this can also be attributed to Talia, given that she's the ultimate mastermind and that she also was in the same prison as Bane. But ultimately, this concept of false hope becomes Bane's downfall. The so-called false hope was hardly false at the end, and turned out to give the heroes an actual legitimate fighting chance to survive. So on Bane's end, while the notion of false hope appeals to his sadism, the question he must face is whether indulging in this sadism is worth giving his enemies the opportunity to recover and retaliate. In hindsight, Bane would say no, as indicated by his choice to simply finish off Bruce rather than waiting for him to see the fire. But sadly for him, it was a lesson learnt too late. At the end, perhaps it's fair to say that while Bane's actions are heinously evil, he remains a misguided individual. It's clear to see that he didn't start out this way, as his saving of Talia in the prison showed that he was capable of empathy and heroic self-sacrifice, both virtues which would be admired by anyone's standard. Again, this all ties back to the crux of his character, which I mentioned earlier, that Bane doesn't have a life purpose of his own, but adopts it vicariously from the people who give him his identity. Ultimately, his morality is derived from the group that he is loyal to, and tragically, he found his belonging in a gang of psychopaths. So if he was found and rescued by a group that had more honorable intentions than the League of Shadows, it's likely that Bane could have turned out to be a force for good instead.